All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something called the Brazilian granular business cycle. We're going to investigate the hidden structural forces that actually drive a country's economic health. We often think of national economies in terms of these massive abstract trends. But what if the reality is much more, well, granular?
Think about this for a second. Could a bad year for just a handful of companies literally drag down the gross domestic product of an entire nation? It sounds totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? We're always taught that national economies are far too vast and way too diversified to be derailed by just a few individual corporate missteps. But the data we're about to look at might completely change your mind.
Traditionally, economists have leaned on this mathematical principle called the law of large numbers. Picture the economy as this vast, smooth ocean. In that old rulebook, individual company shocks basically cancel each other out. If one company struggles, another one thrives, and the overall ocean remains relatively calm. But the fascinating research we're looking at today systematically dismantles that rulebook. It introduces the granular hypothesis, which suggests the economy isn't a smooth ocean at all. Instead, it's more like a pond with massive boulders in it. And when just one of those massive boulders moves, the whole pond ripples.
So to really get this, we need to understand the granular hypothesis. In plain English, this just means that a few disproportionately large firms totally dominate the landscape. Because of their immense scale, their isolated shocks, like say a sudden drop in sales or some big operational failure, they simply do not cancel out against the rest of the market. They're so big that their individual hiccups literally become national macroeconomic events.
Now, to see if this actually holds up in the real world, we're going to use Brazil as our ultimate test case. There's this fantastic 2020 study by researchers Murilo Silva and Sergio da Silva, and they took decades of Brazilian economic data to see if the granular hypothesis actually works outside of just academic theory. And it turns out Brazil provides a perfect laboratory for this.
Okay, get ready for this first massive statistic they uncovered. 24%. That is the chunk of Brazil's entire gross domestic product represented by the net revenues of just its top 100 companies. Out of hundreds of thousands of active businesses in the entire country, just 100 of them account for nearly a quarter of the nation's total economic footprint. Imagine just a few blocks of corporations pulling that much weight.
When you look at the data spanning from 1999 all the way to 2018, it beautifully illustrates just how persistent this is. Notice how the top 100 firms peak at well over 30% at times, and they average out right around that 24% mark. These corporate giants act as those massive grains in our granular economy.
So how do we actually prove that these specific corporate giants are the ones causing the economic waves? Well, the researchers had to do some serious data-driven detective work. They tracked two key metrics: the granular residual and granular volatility. Now, without getting bogged down in the heavy algebra, this essentially means they used specific formulas to isolate the individual shocks hitting just these top firms, completely separating them out from broader, everyday economic trends. Here's how they broke it down. First, they pulled the annual net revenues for the top 500 Brazilian firms going all the way back to 1999. And they supplemented that with quarterly data for publicly listed companies since '97. Then, and this is the crucial part, they mathematically filtered out the broad, industry-wide trends. By doing that, they successfully isolated the purely idiosyncratic shocks that were specific to each giant firm.
And the result of all that rigorous data filtering? It's honestly staggering. When they ran the regressions, the researchers found that individual shocks to just the top 100 companies explain roughly 33%, a full one-third, of all Brazilian GDP fluctuations in their annual data. Just think about the gravity of that for a second. One-third of a nation's total economic ups and downs can be traced back to the specific fortunes of just 100 individual companies.
If you trace the overall volatility of Brazil's GDP and then compare it directly to the granular volatility metrics, the connection is absolutely undeniable. When the big firms get volatile, the whole nation's economy shakes right along with them.
The researchers actually went a step further and managed to pinpoint the exact granular size of the Brazilian economy. Through an intersection of explanatory power curves, they calculated the optimal number of massive firms that control this tide. And that magic number? It's 130. Exactly 130 specific firms act as the primary boulders driving the macroeconomic trends of the entire country.
Okay, so under normal circumstances, these 13 massive companies effectively control the economic tide. But that leads us to a pretty thrilling late-stage twist in the research. What happens to this neat granular rulebook when a global economic tsunami hits? Does the hypothesis actually hold up under extreme worldwide pressure?
To really grasp this twist, we gotta quickly map out Brazil's recent economic timeline to ground our data. Prior to 2008, Brazil was seeing really consistent GDP growth. Then, 2009 hits, and the economy plummets. But that's followed by a massive, sharp recovery in 2010. Later on, by 2015 and 2016, they hit a deep domestic recession. It's a highly turbulent timeline for sure, but it provided the absolute perfect stress test for the researchers' theory.
Now here is where the data gets incredibly fascinating. The researchers decided to literally split their quarterly data precisely at the 2008 global financial crisis, specifically around the collapse of Lehman Brothers. They wanted to test if the rules of the granular economy survived a truly global macro shock that affected the entire world.
The before and after comparison is incredibly stark. In the pre-2008 era, the explanatory power of these granular shocks was huge, accounting for nearly 50% of the variance in their quarterly models. I mean, it was a perfect fit for the hypothesis. But post-2008, the explanatory power basically drops to zero. The granular hypothesis completely breaks down after the crisis.
So, what does this all mean? Well, it reveals a profound paradigm shift. Post-2008, the world fundamentally changed. The researchers concluded that global macro shocks and overwhelming shifts in aggregate demand simply took the wheel. When a true global economic tsunami hits, the massive corporate boulders still exist, obviously, but their individual movements are completely submerged and rendered negligible by the sheer overwhelming power of macroeconomic ocean waves.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. In today's highly interconnected post-2008 world, when we try to predict the health of an economy, should we be watching the individual corporate boulders, or should we be looking out for the macroeconomic ocean waves? I guess it depends entirely on the financial weather. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and remember to keep questioning the hidden forces just beneath the surface.